June 1942, Pearl Harbor Naval Base. The metallic taste of salt hung in the air as Admiral Charles Lockwood stood on the deck of USS Skipjack, his hands gripping a Mark 14 torpedo, casing so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The Hawaiian sun beat down on the submarine berth, but the Admiral felt only cold fury. Before him lay the mathematical certainty of failure. 22 American submarines had returned from patrol in the Pacific, their crews hollow-eyed and bitter, reporting the same impassable truth: their torpedoes were missing. Not some, not many, nearly all of them. Across the vast theater of war, American submarines were firing perfect solutions at Japanese warships, watching their torpedoes run true and straight, only to see them pass harmlessly beneath enemy hulls or strike with the pathetic thud of a dud. The sound that haunted every submariner's dreams was not the roar of depth charges, but that hollow, metallic clunk, the sound of a 21-foot torpedo striking a Japanese ship and failing to explode. The sound of survival denied. The sound of watching a destroyer sail away unscathed, while your submarine dove deep, having revealed its position for nothing. The Mark 14 torpedo represented the cutting edge of American naval engineering, a decade of development, millions of dollars in investment, and the pride of the Bureau of Ordnance. Each torpedo cost $10,000, the price of a comfortable house in 1942 America. The Bureau had designed it in absolute secrecy, tested it in absolute confidence, and deployed it with absolute certainty that American submariners now possessed the finest underwater weapon in the world. The magnetic influence exploder they promised would detonate beneath a ship's keel, breaking its back without even making contact. The precision depth-keeping mechanism would ensure the torpedo ran true. American ingenuity, they proclaimed, had revolutionized naval warfare. But in the first 7 months of the Pacific War, American submarines had achieved a combat effectiveness rate that would have embarrassed a medieval catapult. They were dying for weapons that refused to work. What the admirals and engineers and bureau chiefs expected was glory. They had designed these torpedoes in the pristine laboratories of Newport, Rhode Island, where the water was calm and the targets were stationary and the only enemy was theory. They expected submarine commanders would send glowing reports of Japanese ships breaking in half, of convoys scattered, of the Imperial Navy's merchant fleet sent to the bottom of the Pacific. They expected the Mark 14 to be remembered as the weapon that starved Japan into submission, that cut the oil lifeline from the Dutch East Indies, that made the vast Pacific an American lake. They expected quite simply that their mathematics was infallible, that their testing was sufficient, that their engineering was beyond reproach. They expected submarine commanders to blame their own aim, their own timing, their own nerve, anything but the torpedo itself. What they got instead was mutiny by mathematics. Submarine captains, men who had spent their entire careers respecting the chain of command, began filing reports that bordered on insubordination. Lieutenant Commander Hank Munson of USS Cuttlefish fired 9 torpedoes at perfect range against a stationary tanker, 9 fish running hot, straight, and normal. 8 passed directly beneath the target. 1 struck the hull with an audible clang and bounced off. His patrol report, usually a dry recitation of coordinates and consumables, read like an indictment. The Mark 14 torpedo is defective in depth keeping, defective in exploder function, and has cost this submarine its element of surprise, its expenditure of limited resources, and its crew's faith in Bureau of Ordnance. Commander Dudley Morton of USS Wahoo, one of the most aggressive skippers in the submarine force, returned from patrol and threw a Mark 14 manual onto Admiral Lockwood's desk with enough force to scatter papers. "Sir," Morton said, his voice level but trembling with suppressed rage, "I put 3 torpedoes into a 7,000-ton freighter at 800 yards. Dead certainty. All 3 failed to explode. My men risked their lives for scrap metal." The Bureau of Ordnance responded with the institutional arrogance of men who had never faced an enemy that fired back. The torpedoes, they insisted, were perfect. The problem was submarine commanders who didn't know how to aim, submarine crews who didn't know how to maintain sophisticated equipment, submarine personnel who were making excuses for their own inadequacy. When Admiral English, Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet, suggested that perhaps the torpedoes should be tested more thoroughly, the Bureau responded with a letter so condescending it might have been written to a child. The Mark 14 torpedo has been extensively tested and performs exactly to specifications. We suggest more rigorous training for submarine personnel in the proper use of this weapon. They had fired exactly 2 torpedoes, 2 with live warheads during the entire pre-war testing period, because at $10,000 each, live fire testing was considered wasteful. They had conducted depth tests by firing unarmed torpedoes beneath a target vessel and assuming they ran at the correct depth because no one could see them underwater. They had tested the magnetic influence exploder exactly 0 times under combat conditions because it was too secret to risk exposing its design. And when the war came, when American submarines went forth to battle with weapons that had never been properly tested, the Bureau blamed everyone except themselves. By mid-1942, the crisis had become catastrophic. Japanese convoys were sailing through American-dominated waters with virtual impunity. Submarines would shadow a target for hours, maneuver into perfect firing position, launch a full spread of torpedoes and achieve nothing. The Japanese were conquering the Pacific on a river of oil flowing from the Dutch East Indies, and American submarines, the only force capable of interdicting that flow in the war's early years, were reduced to spectators by their own weapons. Morale in the submarine force approached mutiny. Crews began painting torpedo detail on their hulls with sarcastic pride. They might not be sinking ships, but by God, they were watching their torpedoes run. Some submarines began using their deck guns more than their torpedoes, surfacing to attack merchant ships with their 4-inch artillery, because at least the shells worked. The terrible mathematics of the Pacific War was this: Japan was winning not because their forces were superior, but because American technology had failed at the most critical moment, and the men who had designed that technology refused to admit it. Admiral Lockwood was not a patient man, but he was a thorough one. When he took command of Submarines Pacific Fleet in February 1943, he brought with him a reputation for protecting his submarine crews, even when it meant defying Washington. The Bureau might insist the torpedoes were perfect, but Lockwood had read too many patrol reports, had looked into too many eyes of returning captains, had listened to too many stories of torpedoes that ran deep, that refused to explode, that betrayed every man who trusted them. He did something that seemed revolutionary in the rigid hierarchy of the wartime Navy. He believed his submarine commanders over his bureaucrats, and he decided to run the tests that the Bureau of Ordnance had been too arrogant, too cheap, or too afraid to conduct. The first test was brutally simple. In March 1943, Lockwood ordered submarines to fire torpedoes set for 10 feet depth at fishing nets, suspended at exactly 10 feet below the surface. The theory was straightforward. If the torpedoes ran at correct depth, they would strike the nets. If they ran deep, they would pass beneath. The Bureau of Ordnance called this test unnecessary and wasteful. They were particularly opposed to wasting combat-loaded torpedoes on fishing nets when submarines needed every weapon for combat. Lockwood ignored them. He found a stretch of water off Kahulo Island, had his staff suspend nets at precise depths, and ordered torpedo after torpedo fired. The results were damning. Torpedoes set for 10 feet were running at 25 feet. Torpedoes set for 15 feet were running at 30 feet. The Mark 14 depth-keeping mechanism, the component the Bureau insisted was perfectly calibrated, was causing every torpedo to run 11 feet deeper than set. For 2 years, American submarines had been firing torpedoes that passed harmlessly beneath enemy keels, and the Bureau had blamed submarine commanders for missing. The discovery should have triggered immediate action. Instead, it triggered a bureaucratic war. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted Lockwood's tests were flawed. The Hawaiian water was different, the nets were inaccurate, the testing methodology was unsound. They produced sheaves of paper proving the torpedoes ran at correct depth in Newport testing pools. They questioned Lockwood's competence. They suggested his staff didn't know how to conduct proper tests. They did everything except admit their weapon was defective. But Lockwood had proof now, and he had something more valuable. He had angry submarine commanders who were tired of dying for bureaucratic pride. Without waiting for Bureau approval, Lockwood ordered all submarines to set their torpedoes 11 feet shallower than the target's draft. If you wanted a torpedo to run at 20 feet, set it for 9. Compensate for the Bureau's failure with practical mathematics. And suddenly, American submarines began hitting targets. But But the nightmare wasn't over. Even with the depth problem corrected, more than half of all torpedoes that struck Japanese ships failed to explode. The hollow metallic clunk still echoed across the Pacific. Submarine commanders reported firing torpedoes that hit with perfect geometry, that struck Japanese hulls at the ideal 90-degree angle, that should have detonated with devastating effect, and nothing. The Bureau's response was now familiar. Impossible, they said. The Mark VI exploder was mechanically perfect. If torpedoes were failing to detonate, it was because submarine commanders were firing at improper angles, or the crews were mishandling the weapons, or combat conditions were somehow different from test conditions. The Bureau suggested perhaps submarine personnel needed better training in proper torpedo employment techniques. Admiral Lockwood was done being diplomatic. In June 1943, he ordered another test, this one even more direct. He had his staff obtain a submarine net from the harbor defenses, heavy steel mesh anchored to the seafloor, the kind designed to stop enemy submarines. He suspended from this net a section of cliff face from Kahulaw Island, solid rock, immovable, the most honest target in the Pacific. He ordered submarines to fire torpedoes with live warheads directly at the rock face from point-blank range. No magnetic influence exploder this time. Those had already been deactivated after causing premature explosions. Just the contact exploder, the backup system, the supposedly foolproof mechanical firing pin that would trigger when the torpedo struck its target. The mathematics was undeniable. Torpedo hits rock at 90-degree angle, firing pin compresses, explosion occurs. Except that's not what happened. Torpedo after torpedo struck the rock cliff and failed to explode. Some bounced off, some hit and went dead in the water. Some struck with that haunting metallic sound and sank intact. Out of dozens of test firings, the failure rate exceeded 70%. 70%. The Bureau of Ordnance had sent American submarines to war with a weapon that failed 7 times out of 10, and when submarine commanders reported this failure, the Bureau had called them incompetent. Lockwood's staff examined the recovered torpedoes and found the explanation that should have emerged from proper testing before the war. The Mark VI contact exploder was mechanically fragile. When a torpedo struck a target at the ideal 90-degree angle, the shot every submarine commander trained for, the perfect firing solution, the deceleration was so violent that the firing pin crumpled or jammed before it could trigger the detonator. The Bureau had designed an exploder that was defeated by success, that failed precisely when it struck its target most effectively. It worked in slow-speed testing. It failed in combat. The Bureau's response to this second revelation was even more hostile than the first. They questioned Lockwood's loyalty. They suggested his tests were designed to embarrass the Bureau rather than improve the weapon. They insisted that rock was different from steel hulls, that combat conditions couldn't be replicated in tests, that the Mark VI exploder worked perfectly in their laboratories. They did not send engineers to Hawaii to examine the problem. They did not order new tests. They did not modify the design. They sent strongly worded letters insisting that their torpedo was perfect, and Admiral Lockwood was wrong. By late 1943, the United States Navy had 2 parallel realities. In Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance insisted they had created the perfect torpedo and submarine commanders simply couldn't shoot straight. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Lockwood and his submarine force knew they were fighting with defective weapons, and the Bureau was either criminally incompetent or willfully blind. And then Joan Ridgway appeared. She was not a name the Bureau expected. She was not an admiral or an engineer or a weapons designer. She was a mathematician, 32 years old, employed as a computer, the term in 1943 for humans, usually women who performed complex calculations by hand. The Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Washington employed dozens of such women, brilliant mathematicians doing the tedious computational work that men with engineering degrees considered beneath them. They calculated trajectory tables, analyzed test data, checked the assumptions underlying weapons design. They were essential and invisible, acknowledged in no papers, invited to no meetings, their contributions buried in footnotes if mentioned at all. Joan Ridgway had spent 2 years calculating firing solutions for the Mark XIV torpedo, running endless variations of angle and speed and range through her mechanical calculator, producing the tables that submarine commanders used to aim their weapons. She knew the Mark XIV theoretical performance better than any engineer, and she had begun noticing something that no one else seemed to see. The Bureau's test data didn't make sense. Ridgway had access to all the pre-war testing records, the carefully compiled results from Newport that supposedly proved the Mark 14 worked perfectly. She examined the depth tests, where unarmed torpedoes had been fired beneath target vessels to verify they ran at correct depth. The methodology was simple: set a torpedo for a specific depth, fire it beneath a ship of known draft, and if the torpedo didn't strike the hull, it must have passed beneath at correct depth. The Bureau had conducted dozens of such tests and concluded the depth-keeping mechanism was flawless. But Ridgway noticed something in the numbers. The torpedoes weren't just missing the hulls, they were missing by consistent margins, not random variations that would suggest mechanical imprecision, but systematic offsets that suggested the torpedoes were running deeper than set. Always deeper, never shallower. The pattern was mathematically clear once you looked for it, but no one had looked. The Bureau had seen torpedo missed the hull and concluded success. Ridgway saw torpedo missed by consistent amount and recognized systematic error. She wrote a memo in the careful, apologetic language that women in 1943 used when correcting men with authority. She suggested that perhaps the pre-war depth tests had been misinterpreted. Perhaps the Mark 14 was running deep, and the pre-war tests had simply lacked the precision to catch it. Perhaps Admiral Lockwood's fishing net tests weren't flawed. Perhaps they were the first honest test the Mark 14 had ever received. She sent her memo through channels to the Bureau of Ordnance. It was ignored. She sent a revised version with more detailed statistical analysis. It was ignored. She requested a meeting with the testing division. Her request was denied. Joan Ridgway was a computer, a human calculator, a woman doing mathematics in a world where women's conclusions about weapons was simply not taken seriously. The Bureau had invested millions of dollars and a decade of engineering pride in the Mark 14. They were not about to let some female mathematician suggest they had missed something. But Ridgway was more persistent than the Bureau anticipated. She couldn't force them to listen, but she could make her analysis impossible to ignore. She took her calculations to the Naval Ordnance Laboratory's director over the heads of the Bureau of Ordnance, a breach of protocol that could have ended her career. She showed him the mathematical proof. If you analyzed the pre-war test data with statistical rigor rather than visual confirmation, the Mark 14 was demonstrably running 11 to 13 feet deeper than set. The offset appeared in every test series. The probability that this was random chance was less than 1 in 10,000. The torpedo's depth-keeping mechanism was systematically miscalibrated, and the Bureau's testing methodology had been too crude to detect it. She had proven, with nothing more than test data and mathematical analysis, what Admiral Lockwood had proven with fishing nets and real torpedoes. The Bureau of Ordnance had sent defective weapons to war. The director, to his credit, understood what he was looking at. He forwarded Ridgway's analysis directly to Admiral King, Chief of Naval Operations, bypassing the Bureau of Ordnance entirely. King read the report during a train journey from Washington to Norfolk, and by the time he arrived, he had made a decision. He ordered an immediate independent review of all Mark 14 testing procedures and combat performance data. He appointed a panel of engineers and mathematicians, not from the Bureau of Ordnance, to investigate the torpedo's failures, and he sent a classified message to Admiral Lockwood that acknowledged what submarine commanders had known for 2 years. The Bureau of Ordnance had failed, the torpedo was defective, and fixes were authorized immediately. But even then, the mystery wasn't fully solved. The depth problem was corrected. The contact exploder was redesigned with a sturdier firing pin that wouldn't crumple on impact. By late 1943, the Mark 14 was finally working as it should have from the start. American submarines began achieving the kill rates that pre-war planning had anticipated. Japanese merchant shipping losses skyrocketed. The oil flow from the Dutch East Indies became a trickle. The Pacific War's momentum shifted. And yet there remained one question that haunted everyone who examined the Mark 14 saga. How? How had the Bureau of Ordnance spent a decade developing a torpedo, invested millions of dollars, employed dozens of engineers, conducted hundreds of tests, and completely missed 2 fundamental flaws that crippled the weapon? How had they been so certain of their perfection and so wrong? Joan Ridgway provided the answer in a second report, this one requested by Admiral King himself. She analyzed not just the torpedo's technical failures, but the institutional failures that had allowed those technical problems to remain hidden. Her conclusions were devastating. The Bureau of Ordnance had never conducted proper testing because proper testing was expensive and might reveal problems. They had fired only 2 live torpedoes during the entire pre-war development because live warheads cost money and might damage test infrastructure. They had tested depth keeping with visual observation rather than instrumentation, because installing depth recording equipment in every test torpedo was considered wasteful. They had never tested the contact exploder under realistic impact conditions, because such tests might damage the testing facility. They had created a testing regimen designed not to find problems, but to confirm preconceptions. And when combat revealed what testing should have discovered, they had blamed submarine commanders rather than their own methodology, because admitting failure would have been professionally catastrophic. Ridgway's report included a sentence that became legendary within the Navy's technical community, quoted and requoted in post-war analyses of weapons development. The Bureau tested the Mark 14 not to determine if it worked, but to prove it worked. These are mathematically opposite objectives, and they produce opposite results. The Mark 14 had cost the Navy an estimated $100 million in direct development and manufacturing costs, but the true cost was measured in sunken submarines, in lost crews, in Japanese convoys that sailed unmolested, in oil that reached Japan's war machine in months added to the Pacific War. The failure had killed men, and one mathematician, armed with nothing but test data and a calculator, had exposed what the entire Bureau of Ordnance had refused to see. The Mark 14 torpedo became, in the mathematics of failure, a symbol of institutional arrogance confronting empirical reality. The Bureau had believed their engineers were infallible, their testing was sufficient, their torpedo was perfect. They had responded to contrary evidence, not with investigation, but with accusation. They had defended their creation with the ferocity of parents protecting a child, unable to accept that their weapon was killing American submariners through incompetence rather than enemy action. They had built a system where reporting problems was treated as disloyalty, where combat veterans were considered less reliable than test data, where questioning the Bureau's conclusions was career suicide. They had created the perfect environment for catastrophic failure, and the Mark 14 was the catastrophe. Ridgway's role in solving the crisis remained largely unknown outside classified Navy circles until decades after the war. She received no medal, no promotion, no public recognition. The official Navy histories of the submarine campaign mentioned technical improvements to torpedo performance, without naming the mathematician who had provided the proof that forced those improvements. Her personnel file recorded only that she had been a valuable contributor to ordnance computation during the war years. The same language applied to thousands of other women whose specific contributions were never detailed. The Bureau of Ordnance never acknowledged her analysis publicly, never admitted that a female mathematician had seen what their male engineers had missed, never confronted the uncomfortable truth that institutional hierarchy and gender bias had allowed the Mark 14 flaws to persist, while Joan Ridgway's correct analysis was dismissed. But within the submarine force, her name became synonymous with vindication. Admiral Lockwood mentioned her in his private correspondence as the mathematician who proved what we knew but couldn't prove ourselves. Submarine commanders who survived the war told their children about the mysterious woman in Washington who had saved the submarine campaign with nothing but a calculator and stubborn refusal to accept the Bureau's lies. Engineering officers used her reports as teaching examples of proper statistical analysis versus wishful thinking. Joan Ridgway became, in the oral tradition of the submarine service, the patron saint of speaking truth to institutional power. The corrected Mark 14 transformed the Pacific War. Once the depth-keeping and exploder problems were fixed, in late 1943, American submarines became the most lethal anti-shipping force in military history. By war's end, they had sunk over 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping, more than 5 million tons sent to the Pacific floor. They strangled Japan's economy, severed the resource lifelines from conquered territories, and turned the vast Pacific into a graveyard for Japanese logistics. The submarine campaign that had been an exercise in frustration for the war's first 2 years became a decisive strategic victory, and it happened because one mathematician refused to accept that male engineers with impressive titles couldn't be wrong. The symbolic weight of the Mark 14 extended far beyond its technical specifications. In the mythology of American warfare, weapons were supposed to work. American industry was supposed to be superior. American engineering was supposed to deliver miracles of technology that overwhelmed enemies through sheer innovation. The Mark 14 revealed an uncomfortable truth. American institutions could fail as catastrophically as any other nations. American bureaucrats could be as blind and arrogant as any enemies. And American weapons could be defeated not by Japanese engineering, but by American incompetence. The torpedo that was supposed to represent American technological dominance became instead a symbol of institutional failure, of the danger of untested assumptions, of the catastrophic cost of pride. But it also became a symbol of something else, of the power of individual integrity against institutional inertia. Joan Ridgway had no authority to challenge the Bureau of Ordnance. She had no position that entitled her to question admirals and senior engineers. She was a mathematician in a world that didn't take female mathematicians seriously, a computer performing calculations that men with degrees considered mechanical rather than intellectual work. She could have accepted the Bureau's dismissal of her analysis, could have concluded that if senior engineers said the torpedo was fine, then perhaps her mathematics was wrong, could have remained silent rather than risking her career to prove what the Bureau refused to acknowledge. Instead, she had trusted her numbers, trusted the consistency of her results, trusted that mathematical truth was more powerful than institutional authority. And she had been right. The Mark 14 torpedo, that 21-foot cylinder of steel that had failed so completely for so long, became in the end a testament to both American failure and American self-correction. The failure was bureaucratic arrogance, inadequate testing, refusal to acknowledge problems, and the systemic dismissal of contrary evidence. The self-correction was Admiral Lockwood's determination to test honestly, the submarine force's insistence on truth over hierarchy, Joan Ridgway's mathematical proof, and ultimately the Navy's willingness to acknowledge failure and fix it. The torpedo worked eventually not because American engineering was inherently superior, but because American institutions proved capable, barely, belatedly, of listening to uncomfortable truths. In the post-war analysis of weapons development, the Mark 14 saga became required study at the Naval Academy and engineering schools. Students learned about testing methodology, about the dangers of confirmation bias, about the necessity of challenging assumptions, but they also learned Joan Ridgway's name and the lesson it represented, that truth emerges not from authority but from evidence, not from hierarchy but from mathematics, not from institutional power but from individual integrity. The $100 million torpedo mystery that the Bureau of Ordnance couldn't solve had been solved by a mathematician with a calculator who refused to ignore what the numbers said. By 1945, when the last Mark 14 torpedoes were fired in combat and American submarines prowled Japanese waters with near impunity, the weapon that had begun the war as a symbol of American technological failure had been transformed into an instrument of victory. But those who knew the full story understood that the transformation had nothing to do with the Bureau of Ordnance's original design, and everything to do with the people who had forced the Bureau to confront its mistakes. Admiral Lockwood, who had trusted his submarine commanders over his bureaucrats, the submarine captains who had documented failure with painful precision, the engineers who had analyzed the problems honestly once they were forced to look, and Joan Ridgway, the mathematician who had seen the pattern in numbers that everyone else had ignored. The Mark 14 torpedo rests now in museums, a gleaming artifact of American naval power, its exhibit plaques describing its role in strangling Japan's war economy. But the plaques rarely mention the 2 years of failure, the hundreds of submarine patrols that achieved nothing, the Bureau of Ordnance's institutional blindness, or the mathematician whose analysis finally revealed the truth. The torpedo is displayed as a triumph of American engineering. Those who know its history see it differently, as a reminder that American power derives not from the absence of failure, but from the willingness, however belated and reluctant, to acknowledge failure and correct it. The sound that haunted American submariners' nightmares, that hollow metallic clunk of a torpedo striking its target and failing to explode, eventually faded from the Pacific. The Mark 14 learned to work. Japanese ships learned to fear American submarines. And somewhere in Washington, a mathematician named Joan Ridgway continued performing calculations, her role in saving the submarine campaign known to only a few, her name absent from official histories, her contribution measured in submarines that returned safely, in Japanese ships sunk, in strategic victory achieved. She had solved the mystery that the Bureau of Ordnance couldn't solve, or wouldn't solve, or was too proud to admit needed solving. She had done it with mathematics, persistence, and the revolutionary act of trusting evidence over authority. The Pacific War's submarine campaign is remembered now as one of America's greatest strategic triumphs, a textbook example of sea power projection and economic warfare. But it began as something else entirely, as a catastrophic failure of weapons development, a case study in institutional arrogance, a 2-year exercise in sending men to war with torpedoes that refused to explode. The transformation from failure to triumph required many things: courageous submarine commanders, a determined admiral, honest engineers, and ultimately institutional willingness to acknowledge mistakes. But at the center of that transformation was something simple and profound: a mathematician who looked at numbers everyone else had seen, recognized a pattern everyone else had missed, and refused to stay silent even when authority insisted she was wrong. The Mark 14 torpedo cost $100 million to develop and deploy. Joan Ridgway solved its mystery with a mechanical calculator and a commitment to mathematical truth. In that disparity lies perhaps the most important lesson of the entire saga: that the most expensive weapons are useless without honest testing, that institutional authority is meaningless without intellectual integrity, and that sometimes the most powerful force in warfare is not technology or firepower, but simply the courage to say clearly and persistently what the numbers prove, even when no one wants to hear it.